They called him the Ghost of Red Hollow, a killer hidden in the mountains who took what he wanted and left only blood behind. The town warned Evelyn Mercer to stay away from Rhett Callahan the moment she arrived, whispering that he'd murdered a man years ago during a robbery gone wrong and disappeared into the wilderness before anyone could prove it. But when a blizzard trapped her alone on a frozen cliff with wolves closing in and death only seconds away, it wasn't the law or the church or any decent citizen who came for her. It was him, the outlaw, the ghost, the man everyone feared. And saving her life was only the beginning. If you want to know whether the rumors were true, whether love can grow in a place this cold and unforgiving, and whether two people the world has given up on can still find something worth fighting for, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Red Hollow General Store just after noon, and Evelyn Mercer climbed down into mud so thick it nearly swallowed her boots. The town looked like something scraped together from leftover timber and stubborn hope. Crooked boardwalks, a single church with peeling white paint, and a saloon that seemed to be holding itself upright through sheer determination. Mountains loomed on all sides, their peaks already dusted with October snow, and the wind that cut through the narrow street carried the smell of pine smoke and coming winter. She pulled her trunk from the back of the coach and set it down beside her, scanning the faces of the people who'd stopped to stare. A woman in a faded calico dress whispered something to the man beside her. Two boys sitting on a bench outside the barber shop pointed at Evelyn's traveling coat, which was far too fine for a place like this. She'd known it would be like this. Boston had been full of eyes too, after her mother died. After her father followed 6 months later, drowning his grief in whiskey until his heart gave out. The difference was that Boston had pretended not to stare. Red Hollow didn't bother pretending. "You the one come to work for the Landons?" The voice belonged to a man in a sheriff's badge, tall and graying at the temples, with the kind of face that had seen too much and stopped caring somewhere along the way. "I am," Evelyn said. Evelyn Mercer. "Sheriff Cole Harris." He tipped his hat but didn't offer to shake her hand. "The Landons live about a mile north of town. I can walk you up there if you'd like, or you can wait for Henry Landon to come fetch you." "I'll wait," Evelyn said, though waiting felt like standing in front of a firing squad. Harris nodded and walked off without another word, leaving her alone on the street with her trunk and the weight of a dozen stairs pressing into her back. She'd come west because there was nothing left for her in Boston except empty rooms and memories that hurt too much to hold on to. The Landons had advertised for a teacher in the Boston papers, offering room and board in exchange for lessons for their 3 children and any others in town who wanted them. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way to disappear into something useful. She sat down on the edge of her trunk and waited. 20 minutes later, a wagon pulled up driven by a man with a kind face and work-roughened hands. "Miss Mercer," he called out, "I'm Henry Landon. Sorry to keep you waiting." "No trouble," Evelyn said, climbing up onto the wagon seat beside him. Henry Landon talked the entire ride to his homestead, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the children, 2 girls and a boy, ages 6 to 12, and warning her about the coming winter. "Gets rough up here," he said. "Snow starts in November and doesn't quit till April. You'll want to stock up on supplies before the roads close." Evelyn nodded, but she wasn't really listening. She was watching the mountains, the way they seemed to lean in closer the farther they drove from town, swallowing the sky. The Landon house was small but sturdy, built from logs and surrounded by fields that had already been harvested for the season. Margaret Landon met them at the door, wiping flour from her hands and smiling in a way that looked like it cost her effort. Come in," she said. "You must be exhausted." The children were waiting inside, lined up like soldiers for inspection. The oldest, a girl named Clara, looked Evelyn up and down with the kind of sharp appraisal usually reserved for livestock. The younger 2, Lizzie and Thomas, just stared. "We've set up a room for you in the loft," Margaret said. "It's small, but it's warm. Supper's at 6. We'll start lessons tomorrow if you're up for it." Evelyn thanked her and carried her trunk up the narrow ladder to the loft, where a single window looked out over the fields and toward the dark line of trees beyond. She unpacked slowly, laying out her few belongings, 2 dresses, a coat, a handful of books her mother had loved, and then sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of how far she'd come and how alone she was. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough. The first week passed in a blur of lessons and chores. The children were bright but restless, unused to sitting still for long stretches. Clara tested her constantly, asking questions designed to trip her up, while Thomas refused to read aloud, and Lizzie spent most of her time staring out the window. Evelyn didn't push. She remembered what it felt like to be young and angry at the world for reasons you couldn't name. On Saturday, Margaret sent her into town with a list of supplies and a wagon Henry had hitched up that morning. "Take your time," Margaret said. "It's a nice day for a ride." It was a nice day, clear and cold, with the kind of light that made everything look sharper than it was. Evelyn drove the wagon slowly, letting the horse set the pace, and tried not to think about the fact that she hadn't spoken to anyone outside the Landon family in a week. The general store was crowded when she arrived, full of women buying flour and coffee, and men arguing about the price of seed. Evelyn kept her head down and worked through Margaret's list, piling goods onto the counter while the clerk tallied the cost. She was reaching for a sack of cornmeal when someone behind her spoke. "You're the new teacher." Evelyn turned. The woman was older, maybe 40, with a hard face and eyes that didn't blink. "I am," Evelyn said. "Name's Ruth Calloway. I run the boarding house." Ruth looked her over the same way Clara had, measuring and finding something lacking. "How long you planning to stay?" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "As long as the Landons need me, I suppose." Ruth didn't look convinced. "You seem like a city girl. This place isn't for everyone." "I'll manage," Evelyn said, and turned back to the counter before Ruth could say anything else. But Ruth wasn't finished. "If you're smart, you'll stay close to town. Don't go wandering off into the mountains alone. And if you see a man out there riding a black horse, you turn around and come straight back. Understand?" Evelyn frowned. "Why?" Ruth's expression darkened. "Because Rhett Callahan is dangerous, that's why. He's killed before, and he'll do it again if you give him the chance." Before Evelyn could respond, Ruth walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the store with her heart beating too fast and 100 questions she didn't know how to ask. She finished her shopping in silence and loaded the supplies into the wagon, but Ruth's words followed her all the way back to the Landon homestead. That night, after supper, she asked Henry about it. "Who's Rhett Callahan?" Henry's face went still. Margaret set down her sewing and looked at her husband, then back at Evelyn. "Where'd you hear that name?" Henry asked. "Ruth Calloway mentioned him, said he's dangerous." Henry sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. "Rhett Callahan lives up in the mountains, about 10 miles north of here. Keeps to himself mostly. But there's talk, old talk, that he killed a man during a robbery years back. Nothing was ever proven, but people remember." "Why hasn't he been arrested?" Evelyn asked. "No proof," Henry said. "No witnesses, just rumors. But folks around here don't trust him, and they've got their reasons." "What reasons?" Henry hesitated. "He fought in the war, came back different, they say. Hard. Doesn't talk to anyone, doesn't come into town unless he has to. Some people think he's hiding something, others think he's just broken." Margaret leaned forward. "The point is, Miss Mercer, you should stay away from him. If you see him, you keep your distance. Understood?" Evelyn nodded, but she wasn't sure she understood at all. She'd met plenty of men in Boston who were broken by the war, who carried their scars like weights they couldn't put down. That didn't make them killers, but she didn't argue. The following week brought the first real snow, a light dusting that melted by afternoon but left the air sharp and cold. Evelyn spent her mornings teaching and her afternoons helping Margaret with chores, canning vegetables, mending clothes, preparing for the long winter ahead. It was exhausting work, but it kept her mind occupied, kept her from thinking too much about the life she'd left behind. On Friday, Henry mentioned needing firewood and asked if Evelyn would ride out to the edge of the property to check on a stand of dead timber he'd been meaning to cut. "Just take a look," he said. "If it's dry enough, I'll go out there tomorrow with the axe." Evelyn agreed, grateful for an excuse to get out of the house. She saddled one of the Landons' horses, a gentle mare named Bess, and rode out toward the tree line, following the narrow trail Henry had described. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, and the sky overhead was the color of old iron, heavy with the promise of more snow. She found the stand of timber easily enough, a cluster of dead pines leaning against each other like drunks outside a saloon. She dismounted and walked among them, testing the bark with her fingers, checking for rot. The wood was dry, perfect for burning. She was about to turn back when she heard it. A low growl, somewhere off to her left. She froze. The growl came again, closer this time, and then she saw them. 3 wolves, lean and gray, moving through the trees with the kind of focus that made her stomach drop. They weren't running. They were hunting. And they were hunting her. Evelyn backed toward Bess, moving slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. But the wolves spread out, circling, cutting off her escape. Bess whinnied and pulled against the reins, her eyes rolling white with fear. "Easy," Evelyn whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the horse or herself. The lead wolf stepped forward, teeth bared, and Evelyn knew she was out of time. She grabbed for the saddle horn, trying to pull herself up, but Bess reared and tore the reins from her hands, bolting into the trees and leaving Evelyn alone. The wolves moved in. Evelyn ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't have a plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other and hoping the wolves would lose interest. But they didn't lose interest. They followed, silent and relentless. And when she stumbled over a root and went down hard on her hands and knees, she knew it was over. She turned onto her back, gasping for breath, and watched the lead wolf close the distance between them. Its eyes were yellow and cold, and she could smell the wildness on it, the hunger. And then a gunshot split the air. The wolf yelped and staggered, blood blooming across its shoulder, and the other 2 scattered into the trees. Evelyn scrambled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs, and looked up to see a man on horseback silhouetted against the gray sky. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. The rifle in his hands was still smoking. He didn't say anything, just swung down from the saddle and walked toward her with long, deliberate strides. "You hurt?" His voice was low and rough, like gravel under boots. Evelyn shook her head, unable to speak. The man crouched down beside her, his face still hidden in shadow, and she caught a glimpse of dark eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "What the hell are you doing out here alone?" Her voice cracked. "I was checking timber." Checking timber. He said it like it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. "In wolf country, without a gun." "I didn't know." "No," he said, cutting her off. "You didn't." He stood and offered her his hand. "Can you stand?" She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was strong, calloused, and he let go the moment she was steady. "Your horse ran off," he said. "You won't find it on foot. I'll take you back to town." "I'm not from town," Evelyn said. "I'm staying with the Landons." "Fine. I'll take you to the Landons." He turned and walked back to his horse, a massive black stallion that stood perfectly still despite the smell of blood and gunpowder in the air. Evelyn followed, her legs shaking, and watched as he mounted and then reached down to pull her up behind him. She hesitated. "You got another option?" he asked. She didn't. Evelyn took his hand and let him haul her up onto the saddle behind him. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep from falling, and she could feel the heat of him even through the heavy coat, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. They rode in silence, the horse picking its way through the trees with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the land. Evelyn wanted to say something, to thank him, to ask his name, but every time she opened her mouth, the words disappeared. It wasn't until they were halfway back to the Landon homestead that she finally spoke. "You're Rhett Callahan." He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "Yeah. They say you killed a man. They say a lot of things." His voice was flat, unreadable. "Did you?" He didn't answer. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the Landon homestead, he stopped the horse and let her slide down from the saddle. She stood there, looking up at him, trying to see past the shadow of his hat and the hard line of his jaw. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, then turned the horse and rode back into the trees without another word. Evelyn stood there long after he'd disappeared, her heart still racing, and wondered if the man who'd just saved her life was the same man the town feared. She didn't know, but she knew she'd see him again. Henry found Bess 2 hours later, grazing near the creek with the reins tangled in a low branch. By the time he led the mare back to the homestead, Evelyn had already told Margaret what happened. The wolves, the gunshot, the man on the black horse who'd brought her home. Margaret's face had gone pale, then tight with something that looked like anger mixed with fear. "You're lucky he didn't do worse than save you," Margaret said, her voice sharp enough to cut. Rhett Callahan isn't the kind of man you want owing you anything, and you sure as hell don't want to owe him. He didn't ask for anything, Evelyn said. He just brought me back. This time, Margaret turned back to the stove, her movements jerky and rough. Stay away from him, Miss Mercer. I mean it. Evelyn didn't argue, but she also didn't make any promises. She lay awake that night in the loft, staring at the ceiling and replaying the entire encounter in her head. The way Rhett had moved through the trees like he belonged there. The scar cutting across his face. The flat tone in his voice when he'd asked if she was hurt. She kept thinking about the question she'd asked him, the one he hadn't answered. Did you kill a man? She didn't know why it mattered. She didn't know him. But something about the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd pulled her onto that horse without hesitation, made her think the rumors weren't telling the whole story. Or maybe they were, and she was just foolish enough to want them to be wrong. The snow came hard the next week, heavy and relentless, turning the world outside into something unrecognizable. The fields disappeared under white drifts, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. Henry stopped going into town except when absolutely necessary, and the lessons moved from the kitchen table to the space in front of the fireplace, where the children huddled under blankets and complained about the cold. Evelyn tried to focus on teaching, on the routine of conjugating verbs and practicing arithmetic, but her mind kept drifting. She found herself looking out the window more than she should, scanning the tree line for movement, for the shape of a man on a black horse. She told herself it was ridiculous. He'd done what any decent person would do. He'd helped someone in trouble. That didn't mean anything. But decent people didn't live alone in the mountains with a reputation for murder hanging over their heads. On the third Sunday after the wolves, Evelyn volunteered to check the barn, while Henry and Margaret took the children to the church service in town. The wind had died down overnight, and the sky was clear and painfully blue, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache. She wrapped herself in her heaviest coat and crossed the yard to the barn, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow. The barn was warmer than outside, but not by much. She checked the horses, made sure they had fresh water, and was halfway through mucking out the stalls when she heard hoofbeats outside. She stepped out into the yard and froze. Rhett Callahan sat on his black horse just outside the fence, as still as a statue. He was dressed the same as before. Heavy coat, wide-brimmed hat, but this time she could see his face clearly in the daylight. The scar was worse than she'd thought, a jagged line that looked like it had been stitched badly or not at all. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and he didn't dismount. "You got your horse back," he said. Evelyn nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look. Hair tied back with a scrap of cloth, sleeves rolled up, covered in hay and horse manure. Henry found her by the creek. "Good." He shifted in the saddle, and for a moment she thought he was going to leave. But he didn't. "You been staying close to the house?" "Yes." "Keep it that way. Wolves are still out there, and they're hungry. Winter's been hard on them." "I will," Evelyn said. Then before she could stop herself, "Why do you care?" His jaw tightened. "I don't." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange feeling he was trying to decide whether she was worth the effort of an answer. Finally, he said, "Because the next time you get yourself in trouble, I might not be around to pull you out of it." "I didn't ask you to pull me out of it the first time." "No," he said. "You didn't." The silence stretched between them, cold and awkward, and Evelyn felt her face flush despite the freezing air. She didn't know why she was arguing with him. He'd saved her life. She should be thanking him, not picking a fight. But there was something about the way he looked at her, like she was a problem he hadn't asked for, that made her want to prove she wasn't. "I heard what people say about you," she said. His expression didn't change. "I'm sure you did. They say you killed a man during a robbery, that you're hiding out here because you're afraid of getting caught. Is that what they say?" "Yes." He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the saddle horn, and when he spoke again his voice was colder than the wind. "And what do you think?" Evelyn hesitated. She thought about the way he'd fired that rifle without a second's hesitation, the way he'd crouched beside her in the dirt and asked if she was hurt like it mattered. She thought about the fact that he'd ridden all the way out here just to warn her about wolves, even though he clearly didn't want to be here. "I think if you were really a killer," she said slowly, "you wouldn't have bothered saving me." Something flickered across his face, too fast for her to name. Then it was gone. "You don't know what I am?" "No," she said. "I don't. But I know what you did." He stared at her for another long moment, and then he pulled the reins and turned the horse toward the trees. "Stay out of the mountains, Miss Mercer." "My name's Evelyn." He stopped, didn't turn around. "I know." And then he was gone, disappearing into the pines like smoke. Evelyn stood there in the snow, her heart beating too fast, and wondered what the hell she'd just done. Henry and Margaret returned from church that afternoon full of news. 2 families had left Red Hollow the week before, unable to survive another winter. The general store was running low on coffee and sugar, and Ruth Calloway's son had gotten into a fight at the saloon, accusing a drifter of cheating at cards. "Place is falling apart," Henry said, shaking the snow off his boots. "Another year like this, and there won't be anyone left." Evelyn didn't mention Rhett's visit. She didn't know how to explain it without making it sound like something it wasn't. Instead, she helped Margaret with supper and sat through the evening reading to the children, letting the routine wash over her like water over stone. But that night, alone in the loft, she couldn't stop thinking about him. The next morning, she asked Henry about the robbery. They were in the barn, Henry repairing a broken harness while Evelyn swept the floor. She waited until he was focused on the leather before she spoke. What really happened with Rhett Callahan and that man he's supposed to have killed? Henry's hands stilled. He didn't look up. "Why are you asking?" "Because everyone talks about it, but no one says what actually happened." Henry sighed and set the harness aside. "It was 8 years ago, maybe 9. A man named Carson Webb ran a freight company out of Red Hollow, hauled supplies up into the mining camps, made good money doing it. One night, his wagon got robbed on the road between here and Copper Ridge. Carson fought back, got himself shot for his trouble, died before anyone found him. And people think Rhett did it? Rhett was the only one who knew that route as well as Carson did. He'd worked for the freight company a few years before, knew the schedule, knew where Carson kept his money, and he disappeared right after it happened. Went up into the mountains and didn't come back down for months." "That doesn't mean he did it." "No," Henry said. "It doesn't. But it also doesn't mean he didn't. Sheriff tried to bring him in for questioning, but Rhett wouldn't come. Said if they had proof, they could arrest him. If they didn't, they could leave him alone. And since there wasn't any proof, no witnesses, no stolen goods, they had to let it go. But people still think he's guilty. People think what they want to think," Henry said. "And when a man acts like he's got something to hide, they usually figure he does." Evelyn frowned. "How does he act?" "Like he doesn't give a damn what anyone thinks. Like he'd rather be alone than answer questions. That kind of thing doesn't sit well in a place like this, where everyone knows everyone else's business. Maybe he just wants to be left alone." Henry picked up the harness again, his expression unreadable. "Maybe. Or maybe there's a reason he doesn't want people looking too close." Evelyn let it drop, but the conversation stayed with her. That night, she pulled out one of her mother's books, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and tried to lose herself in the rhythm of the words. But she kept thinking about Rhett, about the way he'd looked at her when she'd said he wasn't a killer, like she'd surprised him, like he wasn't used to people defending him, or like he thought she was an idiot for trying. The days blurred together after that, each one colder than the last. The snow piled higher and the wind turned mean, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the walls. Evelyn taught in the mornings, worked in the afternoons, and spent her evenings reading or mending clothes by the fire. It was a quiet life, the kind she'd thought she wanted when she left Boston. But quiet wasn't the same as peaceful. She thought about Rhett more than she should. She wondered where he lived, what he did with his days, whether he ever got lonely up there in the mountains with no one but himself for company. She wondered if he thought about her at all, or if saving her life had been nothing more than an inconvenience he'd already forgotten. 3 weeks after his visit to the homestead, she saw him again. She'd gone into town with Margaret to pick up supplies, and they were loading sacks of flour into the wagon when someone shouted from across the street. Evelyn looked up and saw a crowd gathering outside the saloon, voices rising in anger. "What's going on?" Margaret asked, shading her eyes against the glare of the snow. "Don't know," Evelyn said, but she had a bad feeling. They crossed the street and pushed through the crowd, and that's when she saw him. Rhett stood in the middle of the street, his horse tied to the post outside the saloon, facing down 3 men who looked like they'd been drinking since breakfast. One of them, a big man with a red face and a thick beard, was jabbing a finger at Rhett's chest. "You got a lot of nerve showing your face in this town," the man said, his voice slurred and loud. "After what you did." Rhett didn't move. "I didn't do anything, Frank." "Bullshit," Frank spat. "Carson Webb was a good man and you killed him for a bag of money. Everyone knows it." "No one knows it," Rhett said, his voice low and even. "Because it didn't happen." "Then why'd you run? Why'd you disappear into the mountains like a coward?" "Because I got tired of listening to men like you run your mouths." Frank's face went darker, and he stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm calling you drunk." One of the other men grabbed Frank's arm, trying to pull him back, but Frank shook him off. "You think you're so damn tough, living up there by yourself like some kind of ghost, but you're just a killer who got lucky." Rhett's expression didn't change, but Evelyn saw his hands tighten at his sides. "Walk away, Frank." "Or what? You gonna shoot me like you shot Carson?" The crowd went silent. Evelyn could feel the tension coiling tighter, could see the way Rhett's jaw worked like he was biting back words he knew better than to say. And then, before she could think about what she was doing, she stepped forward. "He didn't shoot anyone," she said. Every head turned toward her. Margaret grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but Evelyn shook her off. She walked straight up to Frank and looked him in the eye, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "You don't know that," Frank said. "Neither do you," Evelyn shot back. "You're accusing him based on what? Rumors? Guesses? That's not proof. That's just cowardice." Frank's face twisted with anger. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who isn't afraid to use her brain," Evelyn said. "You should try it sometime." The crowd murmured, a few people laughing, and Frank looked like he wanted to hit something. But before he could move, Sheriff Harris pushed through the crowd and stepped between them. "That's enough," Harris said. "Frank, go sleep it off." "Rhett, get out of here before this gets worse." Frank glared at Evelyn, then at Rhett, and finally turned and stumbled back toward the saloon. The crowd began to disperse, people muttering to each other as they walked away. Harris gave Evelyn a long, unreadable look, then nodded at Rhett and walked off. Evelyn turned to find Rhett staring at her, his expression somewhere between disbelief and anger. "What the hell was that?" he said. "I was helping you." "I didn't ask for your help." "You didn't have to," Evelyn said. "He was wrong, and someone needed to say it." "You don't know if he was wrong." "Yes, I do." Rhett stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You don't know me, Evelyn. You don't know what I've done or what I'm capable of. Defending me in front of half the town just makes you look like a fool." "Maybe I am a fool," she said, "but at least I'm not a coward who lets people believe lies because I'm too stubborn to tell the truth." His eyes narrowed. "You think you've got me figured out?" "No," she said, "but I think you're tired of being alone, and you're too proud to admit it." For a moment he just stared at her, and she thought he might actually tell her to go to hell, but then he turned, untied his horse, and swung up into the saddle. "Stay out of my business," he said, and then he rode off, leaving her standing in the street with Margaret pulling at her arm and the whole town watching. "What were you thinking?" Margaret hissed as they climbed back into the wagon. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't know what she'd been thinking. She just knew that watching Rhett stand there alone, facing down a crowd that had already decided he was guilty, had made something in her chest twist so hard she couldn't breathe. She didn't see him again for 2 weeks, but she thought about him every day. When he finally came back, it wasn't to the Landon homestead. It was to the ridge above the house, where Evelyn had gone to collect pine boughs for Margaret's kitchen. She was pulling branches from a low-hanging tree when she heard hoofbeats and turned to find him sitting on his horse at the edge of the clearing. "You got a habit of wandering off alone," he said. "I'm not alone," Evelyn said. "You're here." "That's not what I meant." She dropped the pine boughs into the sack at her feet and wiped her hands on her skirt. "Did you come all the way out here just to lecture me?" "No." He dismounted, leading the horse closer. "I came to say you shouldn't have done that." "Defended you?" "Yes." "Why not?" "Because now people are going to think you're involved with me." "I don't care what people think." "You should," Rhett said. "This town doesn't forgive easy." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Neither do you, apparently." He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like he was ready to bolt at any second. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Then explain it to me." I can't. Why not? Because it's safer if you don't know. Evelyn took a step closer. I'm not afraid of you. You should be. Why? Because you might have killed a man 8 years ago? Because people say you're dangerous? She shook her head. I've met dangerous men, Rhett. They don't warn people to stay away. They don't ride out in the middle of a snowstorm to tell someone to watch out for wolves. And they sure as hell don't look at me the way you're looking at me right now. His expression cracked, just for a second, and she saw something underneath, something raw and tired and lonely. You don't know me. Then let me. He stared at her, and she thought he might actually say yes. But then he shook his head and turned back to his horse. Go home, Evelyn. Rhett, go home. He mounted and rode off before she could say anything else, and she stood there in the snow, her chest aching, and wondered why it hurt so much to watch him leave. But she didn't go home. Not right away. Because she'd seen the look in his eyes, and she knew one thing for certain. Whatever Rhett Callahan was hiding, it wasn't murder. It was something worse. It was the fear that no one would believe him even if he told the truth. Winter deepened, and with it came a cold so brutal it felt personal. The kind that crept through walls and settled in your bones. That turned breath to ice and made every step outside feel like a gamble. Evelyn stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary, and the lessons with the Landon children moved entirely to the space in front of the fireplace, where they huddled under quilts and complained less about arithmetic and more about frostbite. But even in the grip of that cold, Evelyn found reasons to go outside. She checked the barn more than necessary, walked the fence line when Henry was too busy, and volunteered to haul water from the creek even though it meant breaking through a layer of ice thick enough to stand on. Margaret watched her with increasingly sharp eyes, but said nothing, which was somehow worse than an argument. Evelyn told herself she wasn't looking for Rhett. She told herself she'd given up on whatever foolish notion had driven her to defend him in the middle of Red Hollow's main street. But every time she stepped outside, her eyes scanned the tree line. Every time she heard hoofbeats, her heart jumped. He didn't come back. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The snow piled higher, and the wind turned vicious, howling through the valley like something wounded. Henry mentioned during supper one night that the pass to Copper Ridge had closed early this year, trapping 2 miners on the wrong side of the mountain. They'll have to wait it out, he said, shaking his head, assuming they've got enough supplies to last. What if they don't? Clara asked, her face pale. Then they won't make it to spring, Henry said bluntly. Margaret shot him a warning look, but he just shrugged. No point sugarcoating it. Mountains don't care about hope. Evelyn thought about that later, lying awake in the loft while the wind rattled the shutters. She thought about Rhett, alone in some cabin hidden among the pines, and wondered if he had enough firewood, enough food, enough of whatever it took to survive a winter like this. She wondered if he even cared. The next morning, she asked Henry where Rhett's cabin was. Henry paused in the middle of hitching the wagon, his hands freezing on the leather straps. Why? Just curious, Evelyn said, keeping her voice light. Henry straightened and looked at her hard. You planning to go up there? No. Good. Because if you were, I'd tell you it's a fool's errand. Rhett Callahan doesn't want visitors, and the trail up to his place is dangerous even in good weather. In winter, it's suicide. I'm not planning to visit him, Evelyn said. I just want to know where he is. Why? She didn't have a good answer for that, so she didn't give one. Henry stared at her for another long moment, then sighed and went back to the harness. North Ridge, he said finally. Follow the creek up past the old mill, then take the trail that cuts east through the pines. It's maybe 10 miles from here, but it'll feel like 50 in this snow. And if you do go up there, which you won't, you bring a rifle and you don't go alone. I said I'm not going. I heard you, Henry said. Doesn't mean I believe you. She let it drop, but the information settled in her mind like a stone dropping into still water. 10 miles, North Ridge, past the old mill. She filed it away and told herself she didn't care. But she did. On the first Saturday in December, Red Hollow held its annual winter gathering in the church hall, a tradition meant to lift spirits before the worst of the season set in. Margaret insisted Evelyn come along, despite Evelyn's protest that she'd rather stay home with a book. You need to meet people, Margaret said firmly. You can't hide at the homestead forever. The hall was packed when they arrived, smelling of wood smoke and mulled cider and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Tables lined the walls, covered with food the families had brought to share. Venison stew, cornbread, dried apples, pies made from the last of the summer berries. Children ran wild between the adults, shrieking and laughing, while the men gathered in clusters near the door and the women congregated around the stove. Evelyn stood near the back, nursing a cup of cider and trying to look less out of place than she felt. Ruth Calloway appeared beside her within minutes, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Evelyn's dress, her hair, the way she held herself apart from the crowd. "Still here, I see," Ruth said. "Still here," Evelyn agreed. "Thought you might have run off by now. City girls usually don't last past the first snow." "I'm not running." Ruth's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We'll see." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Heard you made a scene in town a few weeks back, defending Rhett Callahan in front of half the county." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "I said what needed saying." "What needed saying?" Ruth repeated, like the words tasted bad. "Girl, you don't know this place yet. You don't know how things work. Rhett Callahan is trouble, and anyone who stands up for him becomes trouble by association. You'd do well to remember that." "I'll keep it in mind," Evelyn said flatly. Ruth looked like she wanted to say more, but someone called her name from across the room, and she walked away with a final disapproving glance. Evelyn let out a slow breath and took another sip of cider, wishing she'd stayed home. The evening dragged on. People ate and talked and danced to the fiddler who'd set up in the corner, playing old songs that everyone seemed to know by heart. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, feeling like a ghost at her own funeral. She was about to make an excuse to leave when the door slammed open and a man stumbled in, his face red from cold and panic. "The Garrett kids are missing," he gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. "Ben and Sarah. They went out after lunch to check the traps and never came back." The hall went silent. Then everyone started talking at once, voices rising in a chaotic wave of concern and fear. Sheriff Harris pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "How long have they been gone?" "6 hours. Maybe 7, the man said. "We've been searching, but the snow's too deep and it's getting dark. We can't see tracks anymore." "Where were they headed?" "North Ridge, near the old mill." Evelyn's stomach dropped. Harris cursed under his breath and turned to the crowd. "I need volunteers. Anyone with a horse and a rifle, meet me outside in 5 minutes. We're going up there tonight." Men started moving immediately, grabbing coats and calling for their sons. But Evelyn heard the doubt in their voices, saw the way they avoided looking at the Garrett's mother, who'd sunk into a chair with her hands pressed to her mouth. No one thought they'd find those kids alive. Not in this cold, not in the dark. Evelyn pushed through the crowd and grabbed Harris's arm. "Rhett Callahan lives up there. He knows that ridge better than anyone." Harris pulled his arm free. "Rhett Callahan is the last person I'm asking for help." "Why? Because people think he's a killer? Or because you're too proud to admit you need him?" Harris's face hardened. "Watch your mouth, Miss Mercer." "Those kids don't care about pride," Evelyn shot back. "They care about surviving the night, and if anyone can find them up there, it's him." "She's right," a voice said from behind her. Evelyn turned to find Henry stepping forward, his expression reluctant but firm. "Rhett knows those mountains. If anyone can track in this weather, it's him." Harris looked between them, his jaw working. Then he swore again and grabbed his coat. "Fine. Someone ride out to Callahan's place and tell him what's happening. If he wants to help, he can meet us at the mill. If he doesn't, we go without him." "I'll go," Evelyn said before anyone else could volunteer. "The hell you will," Harris said. "You'll stay here with the women." "I know the way to his cabin," Evelyn lied, "and I'm the one who suggested asking him. He'll listen to me." "You don't know that." "Neither do you." Harris stared at her like he was trying to decide if she was brave or insane. Finally, he nodded. "Take Henry's horse. Ride fast and don't stop for anything. You've got an hour to get him and meet us at the mill. After that, we're moving with or without him." Evelyn didn't wait for him to change his mind. She grabbed her coat and ran outside where Henry was already saddling Bess. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," Evelyn said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Henry handed her the reins and a rifle. "North Ridge, follow the creek. Don't get lost." "I won't." "And Evelyn?" He caught her arm, his face serious. "If he says no, don't push him. Just come back. She nodded, swung up into the saddle, and kicked Bess into motion before her nerve could fail. The ride was brutal. The snow was deep enough to slow Bess to a plodding walk, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by the pale light of a half-moon. Evelyn's hands ached from gripping the reins, and her face burned with cold despite the scarf wrapped around her mouth and nose. She followed the creek north, just like Henry had said, and found the remains of the old mill half buried in snow. From there, she turned east into the pines, following a trail that was barely visible under the drifts. She almost missed this cabin entirely. It was set back from the trail, tucked into a clearing surrounded by trees with smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. A single lantern burned in the window, casting a weak yellow glow onto the snow. Evelyn dismounted and tied Bess to a post near the door. Her legs shook as she walked up to the cabin, and for a moment she just stood there, staring at the rough wooden door and wondering what the hell she was doing. Then she knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and Rhett stood there with a rifle in one hand and an expression that shifted from surprise to anger in the span of a heartbeat. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Two kids are missing on the North Ridge," Evelyn said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Ben and Sarah Garrett. They've been gone since this afternoon. Sheriff Harris is organizing a search party, but it's dark and the snow's too deep and no one knows the ridge like you do. We need your help." Rhett's face didn't change. "No." "Rhett, I said no." He started to close the door, but Evelyn shoved her boot into the gap. "They're children," she said. "They're lost and scared and probably freezing to death right now. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Rhett said, his voice cold. "I don't owe this town anything. This isn't about the town. It's about two kids who don't deserve to die because you're too stubborn to help. They've got a sheriff and a dozen men. They don't need me." "Yes, they do," Evelyn said. "Because none of those men know the ridge the way you do. None of them have survived up here the way you have. You know where someone would go to hide from the wind, where the snow drifts are dangerous, where the cliffs drop off. Without you, they're just going to stumble around in the dark until someone else gets hurt." Rhett stared at her, his jaw tight. "Why do you care?" "Because I'm not the kind of person who lets kids die when I can do something about it," Evelyn said. "And neither are you. You don't know what kind of person I am." "Yes, I do," she said quietly. "You're the kind who rides out in a storm to warn someone about wolves. The kind who pulls a stranger onto his horse even though he'd rather be left alone. The kind who pretends he doesn't care because it's easier than admitting he does." For a long moment he just looked at her, and she thought she saw something crack in his expression, something tired and old and beaten down. Then he stepped back and grabbed his coat from a peg on the wall. "Wait here," he said. He disappeared into the back of the cabin and returned a minute later with a saddlebag, a lantern, and a coil of rope. He pushed past her without a word and walked to the small barn beside the cabin where his black horse stood waiting. Evelyn followed, her heart pounding, and watched as he saddled the horse with quick, efficient movements. "You're going to meet Harris at the mill," Rhett said without looking at her. "Then you're going back to the Landons." "I'm coming with you." "No, you're not." "Yes, I am." He turned to face her, his eyes hard. "This isn't a game, Evelyn. Those mountains will kill you if you make one wrong move, and I'm not dragging your frozen corpse back to town because you were too proud to stay behind." "Then don't let me make a wrong move," she said. "Teach me." "I don't have time to teach you." "Then I'll keep up on my own." Rhett looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't have time, and they both knew it. He swore under his breath, swung up into the saddle, and held out his hand. "If you fall behind, I'm not stopping. Understand?" "Understood." She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him, just like the first time, and wrapped her arms around his waist as he kicked the horse into motion. They rode hard through the trees, Bess following close behind on a lead rope, and Evelyn pressed her face against Rhett's back to shield it from the wind. They reached the mill in less than 30 minutes. Harris and his men were already there, mounted and waiting, their faces grim in the lantern light. When Rhett rode into the clearing, every head turned and the conversation died. Harris nudged his horse forward, his expression unreadable. "Callahan." "Harris." "Didn't think you'd come." "I didn't think you'd ask." Harris almost smiled. "I didn't. She did." He nodded toward Evelyn, and Rhett didn't respond. "You know this ridge better than anyone. Where would two kids go if they were trying to get out of the storm?" Rhett was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Depends on how smart they are. If they kept moving, they're probably dead already. If they found shelter, there's a chance. There's an old trapper's cabin about 3 miles northeast of here, near the base of Widow's Peak. It's half collapsed, but it's got a roof and walls. If they made it that far, that's where they'd be. And if they didn't, then we're looking for bodies. The men shifted uneasily, but Harris just nodded. Lead the way. Rhett turned his horse and headed into the trees without waiting to see if they followed. Evelyn tightened her grip on his waist as the group fell in behind them, lanterns swaying in the darkness, and tried not to think about what they'd find when they reached that cabin. The ride was slow and treacherous. The snow was deep enough to reach the horses' chests in places, and the wind cut through the trees like knives. Rhett led them along a narrow trail that twisted through the pines, avoiding the deeper drifts and the places where the ground dropped away into darkness. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses around fallen trees, and once Rhett stopped entirely, holding up a hand for silence while he listened to something Evelyn couldn't hear. What is it? Harris called. Wolves, Rhett said. They're close. How close? Close enough. He kicked his horse forward again, faster this time, and the group followed. Evelyn could hear the wolves now, their howls rising and falling in the distance, and she felt Rhett's body tense beneath her hands. They won't attack the group, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But if those kids are out here alone, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They found the cabin 40 minutes later, a sagging structure barely visible against the snow. Rhett dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and ran to the door, shoving it open with his shoulder. Evelyn slid down from the saddle and followed, her legs numb and unsteady. Inside, huddled together in the corner beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, were Ben and Sarah Garrett. They were alive. Rhett crouched down beside them, checking for injuries while Evelyn grabbed the lantern and held it high. Ben was maybe 10, his face pale and streaked with tears. Sarah was younger, maybe 7, and she wasn't crying. She was just staring at nothing, her lips blue with cold. They're hypothermic, Rhett said. We need to get them warm, now. Harris and 2 other men crowded into the cabin, stripping off their coats and wrapping them around the children. Someone lit a fire in the broken stove, coaxing it to life with dry kindling from Rhett's saddlebag. Evelyn rubbed Sarah's hands between her own, trying to bring feeling back into the frozen fingers, while Rhett worked on Ben. You're going to be okay, Evelyn whispered to Sarah. We've got you. You're safe now. Sarah blinked slowly, her eyes focusing on Evelyn's face. The man saved us, she said, her voice barely audible. The ghost man. Evelyn glanced at Rhett, who was lifting Ben into his arms. Yeah, she said softly. He did. It took another hour to get the kids stable enough to move. By the time they started back toward the mill, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the stars fading into the pale gray of pre-dawn. Rhett carried Sarah on his horse while one of Harris's men carried Ben, and the group moved slowly, carefully, no one speaking. When they finally reached Red Hollow, the entire town was waiting. The Garrett's mother ran forward with a cry that broke something in Evelyn's chest, pulling her children into her arms and sobbing so hard she couldn't stand. People crowded around, voices rising in relief and gratitude, and someone clapped Rhett on the shoulder. He pulled away immediately. His face shuddered and mounted his horse without a word. Callahan, Harris called. Wait. Rhett stopped but didn't turn around. Thank you, Harris said. Rhett didn't respond. He just kicked his horse into motion and rode out of town, disappearing into the trees before anyone could say anything else. Evelyn watched him go, her chest tight, and knew she couldn't let it end like this. She borrowed Bess from Henry, ignoring his protests, and rode after him. She caught up to him halfway to his cabin, calling his name until he finally stopped and turned. What? He said, his voice rough. You can't just leave, Evelyn said. Not after what you did. I did what I had to do. Now it's done. It's not done, she said. The whole town saw what you did. They know you're not what they thought. They don't know anything, Rhett said, and neither do you. Then tell me, Evelyn said, riding closer. Tell me the truth. Did you kill Carson Webb? He stared at her for a long time, and she thought he wasn't going to answer, but then he said, no. Then why didn't you defend yourself? Why did you let them think you were guilty? Because it was easier than fighting, he said. Because I was tired, and I didn't care anymore. And now? Now I still don't care. Liar, Evelyn said softly. Rhett's jaw tightened. Go home, Evelyn. Not until you admit you care. About what? About those kids. About this town. About me. The last words came out before she could stop them, and she saw the way they hit him, the way his expression shifted into something raw and unguarded. You don't want me to care about you, he said quietly. Yes, I do. Why? Because I care about you, she said, and I think you care about me too, and I think that scares you more than anything else in this world. He didn't deny it. He just looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than walls and distance. She saw the man underneath, the one who'd saved her life, who'd ridden into a storm to rescue 2 children, who'd spent years hiding because he didn't know how to stop. I'm not good for you, he said finally. Let me decide that. He shook his head, but he didn't right away. And when Evelyn nudged Bess closer, close enough that their legs almost touched, he didn't pull back. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to stop running, Evelyn said. I want you to come down from this mountain and live like you're not already dead. I want you to let someone see you without all the armor. And if I can't, then I'll wait until you can. Rhett looked at her like she'd just said something incomprehensible, and maybe she had, but she meant it, every word. He didn't answer her, not with words, but he didn't right away either, and that felt like something. They sat there on their horses in the cold gray light of dawn, the world around them silent except for the wind moving through the pines, and Evelyn watched the struggle play out across his face, the part of him that wanted to believe her fighting against the part that had spent too many years alone. Finally, he turned his horse toward the trail. Come on, he said. I'll take you back. I don't need you to take me back. I know, Rhett said, but I'm doing it anyway. They rode side by side through the snow, not speaking, and when they reached the edge of the Landon property, Rhett stopped. You should get some rest, he said. You've been up all night. So have you. I'm used to it. Evelyn turned Bess to face him. Will I see you again? He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought he might say no, but instead he said, maybe. It wasn't a promise, but it was more than she'd expected. She watched him ride away, and this time it didn't hurt as much, because this time she believed he'd come back. The town treated Rhett differently after that night. Not warmly. Red Hollow wasn't the kind of place that forgot its grudges easily, but with a grudging respect that hadn't been there before. People nodded when they passed him on the street. The men at the saloon stopped talking when he walked in, but they didn't turn their backs. And when Mrs. Garrett saw him outside the general store 2 weeks later, she walked straight up to him and took his hand. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. I don't care what anyone says about you. You saved my children, and I won't forget it. Rhett didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and walked away before she could say anything else. But Evelyn, who'd been standing nearby loading supplies into the Landon's wagon, saw the way his shoulders straightened just a little, saw the way he didn't pull his hat down quite as low. He started coming into town more often after that. Not every day, but enough that people got used to seeing him. He'd tie his horse outside the general store and buy coffee or flour or nails, then leave without talking to anyone. But he stopped avoiding eye contact, stopped acting like he was braced for a fight every time someone looked at him. And he started showing up at the Landon homestead. The first time, he brought firewood, just rode up to the barn with a full cord strapped to his horse and unloaded it without saying a word. Henry came out to see what the noise was about and found Rhett stacking split logs against the side of the barn. What's this for? Henry asked. You're low, Rhett said. Figured you could use it. Henry looked at the wood, then at Rhett, then at Evelyn, who was standing in the doorway of the house trying not to look too pleased. Much obliged, Henry said finally. What do I owe you? Nothing. Rhett, I said nothing. He finished stacking the last of the wood and mounted his horse. You helped me when I needed it. This is me returning the favor. He rode off before Henry could argue, and that night at supper Henry shook his head and said, That man's a puzzle. He's not a puzzle, Margaret said, glancing at Evelyn. He's lonely. Evelyn didn't respond, but her face went warm, and Margaret smiled into her stew. The second time Rhett came by, He fixed the broken hinge on the barn door that Henry had been meaning to get to for weeks. The third time, he brought a book, a worn copy of Whitman's poems, and handed it to Evelyn without explanation. "I saw it at the trading post," he said. "Thought you might like it." Evelyn opened the cover and saw an inscription in faded ink. "To Carson, from M." Her throat tightened. This was Carson Webb's. Yeah. "Where did you get it?" "Found it in his wagon after he died," Rhett said. "Kept it all these years, figured maybe it meant something to someone. Never knew who M was, though." "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because you're the only person I know who'd care about old poetry," he said, "and because I'm tired of carrying it around." He left before she could ask any more questions, but that night she read every poem in the book twice, running her fingers over Carson Webb's name and wondering what it meant that Rhett had kept this piece of a dead man's life for so long. December bled into January, and the cold settled in with a permanence that made it hard to remember what warmth felt like. But Evelyn barely noticed. She was too busy watching Rhett slowly, cautiously, start to come back to life. He began staying longer when he visited. He'd sit on the porch with Henry and talk about the weather, about the condition of the trails, about nothing in particular. He'd help with chores without being asked, mending fence posts, hauling water, checking the horses. And sometimes, when the work was done, he'd stay for supper. Margaret didn't trust it at first. She watched him with the same wariness she'd have given a wild animal that wandered too close to the house. But Rhett was unfailingly polite, and he never overstayed his welcome. And after a while, even Margaret seemed to soften. "He's not what I expected," she admitted to Evelyn one night while they were washing dishes. "What did you expect? Someone colder, I suppose, meaner, but he's just—" She paused, searching for the word. "Sad. Like he's been sad for a very long time and doesn't know how to stop." Evelyn didn't disagree. The first time Rhett asked Evelyn to ride with him, it was late January, and the snow had finally stopped falling long enough for the sky to clear. He showed up at the homestead just after breakfast, leading a second horse, a calm bay mare with kind eyes. "Thought you might want to see the ridge," he said. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and followed him, ignoring Margaret's disapproving look. They rode north, away from the homestead and into the mountains, following trails that Evelyn had never seen. Rhett didn't talk much, but he pointed things out as they went. The place where a bear had clawed marks into a tree, the frozen waterfall hidden in a ravine, the clearing where he'd once seen a herd of elk so large it took 10 minutes for them all to pass. "How long have you lived up here?" Evelyn asked. 8 years? Maybe 9? I lose track. Don't you ever get lonely?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Every day? Then why stay? Because lonely's easier than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "Letting people see you," Rhett said, "and watching them decide you're not worth the effort." Evelyn's chest tightened. "Is that what you think I'll do?" "I think you don't know me well enough to decide yet." "Then let me know you." He didn't answer, but he kept riding, and she took that as permission. They stopped near the edge of a cliff that overlooked the valley, and Rhett dismounted to let the horses rest. Evelyn followed, standing beside him and staring out at the endless stretch of white and green below. It was beautiful in a way that hurt, the kind of beauty that reminded you how small you were, how temporary. "I killed someone during the war," Rhett said suddenly. Evelyn turned to look at him, but he was still staring at the valley. "A lot of people killed someone during the war," she said carefully. "Not like this." His jaw worked. "We were camped near a river, and a Confederate scout stumbled into our lines. He was young, maybe 17, scared out of his mind. My captain told me to take him into the woods and deal with it, so I did." "You shot him?" "Yeah." His voice was flat, empty. "He begged me not to. Said he had a family. Said he didn't even believe in the war. He'd just been conscripted. And I shot him anyway because that's what soldiers do. We follow orders." Evelyn didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "When I came back here after the war," Rhett continued, "I couldn't stop seeing his face. Couldn't stop hearing him beg. And when Carson Webb got killed and people started looking at me like I was capable of murder, part of me thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was exactly what they thought I was." "But you didn't kill Carson." "No," Rhett said, "but I could have. That's what scares me. I know what it feels like to take a life. I know how easy it is to pull a trigger and watch someone stop being a person. And I don't know if that makes me dangerous or just broken. Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that their arms were almost touching. It makes you human, she said quietly. War does terrible things to people, Rhett. It asks you to do things no one should have to do. But that doesn't mean you're the same person who pulled that trigger. It doesn't mean you're a killer. How do you know? Because a killer wouldn't have spent 8 years carrying around a dead man's book of poetry, she said. A killer wouldn't have ridden into a storm to save 2 kids he didn't know. A killer wouldn't have warned me about wolves or brought firewood to a family that never asked for it. You're not what you think you are. Rhett finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw. What am I then? Someone who deserves a second chance, Evelyn said. Someone who deserves to stop punishing himself for being human. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he looked away, his throat working. I don't know how to do that. Then I'll help you. Why? Because you helped me, she said. You saved my life, Rhett, and not just from the wolves. You gave me a reason to care about something again, a reason to stay. I was drowning in Boston, drowning in grief and guilt and 100 other things I couldn't name. And coming here, meeting you, it pulled me out. So maybe I can do the same for you. Rhett shook his head slowly, but there was something softer in his expression now, something that looked almost like hope. You're too good for this place, he said. And you're too stubborn for your own good, Evelyn said. But I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well get used to it. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. You're a pain in the ass, you know that? I've been told. They stood there in silence, and for the first time since Evelyn had met him, Rhett looked like he wasn't carrying quite so much weight. Like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe he didn't have to carry it alone. They rode back to the homestead as the sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink, and when they reached the barn, Rhett hesitated before turning to leave. Evelyn, he said. Yeah? Thank you, she smiled. For what? For not giving up on me. I'm not going to, she said, so don't give me a reason to. He nodded, and this time when he rode away, Evelyn didn't feel like she was watching him disappear. She felt like she was watching him come back. Over the next few weeks, Rhett became a fixture at the Landon homestead. He taught Thomas how to track rabbits in the snow. He helped Clara with her reading, patiently sounding out words she stumbled over. He even let Lizzie braid his horse's mane one afternoon, standing by with a look of resigned patience while she chattered about nothing in particular. And he spent more and more time with Evelyn. They rode together almost every day, exploring the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the war, about the men he'd served with, about the nightmares that still woke him in the middle of the night. She told him about her parents, about the suffocating weight of grief, about the way Boston had started to feel like a cage she couldn't escape. I thought leaving would fix it, she said one afternoon as they sat beside a frozen stream. I thought if I could just get far enough away, I'd stop feeling like I was drowning, but it didn't work. I still felt it, even here. And now? Rhett asked. Now I feel like I'm swimming, Evelyn said. It's still hard, and I still miss them, but I'm not drowning anymore. What changed? She looked at him. You did. Rhett's expression shifted, and he reached out slowly, carefully, like he was afraid she'd pull away. But she didn't. She let him take her hand, let him lace his rough fingers through hers, and they sat there in the snow while the world went quiet around them. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. Stop saying that, Evelyn said. You deserve to be happy, Rhett. You deserve to have someone who sees you for who you really are, not who people think you are. And I see you, I see all of it, and I'm still here. He squeezed her hand. I'm glad you are. Me too. It wasn't a declaration of love, it wasn't a promise, but it was real, and it was enough. The peace didn't last. It was early February when the trouble started. Evelyn was in town with Margaret, picking up supplies, when she overheard Frank, the same drunk who'd confronted Rhett at the winter gathering, talking outside the saloon. I'm telling you, something's not right, Frank was saying to a group of men. Carson's brother just came through from Denver asking questions. Says he's got new information about the robbery. Says there's proof Callahan was involved. Evelyn's stomach dropped. What kind of proof? One of the men asked. Didn't say, Frank said. But he's meeting with the sheriff this afternoon. Guess we'll find out then. Evelyn didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her toward the wagon. We need to go. Now. What? Why? I'll explain later. Just trust me. Margaret must have seen something in Evelyn's face because she didn't argue. They loaded the supplies as fast as they could and drove back to the homestead, where Evelyn immediately saddled Bess and rode for Rhett's cabin. She found him outside chopping wood, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. He looked up when he heard her coming, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. What's wrong? He asked. Carson Webb's brother is in town, Evelyn said, dismounting. He's meeting with the sheriff. Frank says he has new information about the robbery, proof that you were involved. Rhett set down the axe, his face going still. What kind of proof? I don't know, but Rhett, if the sheriff comes for you, sus, then I'll deal with it. How? By running? By letting them think you're guilty again. I didn't run the first time, Rhett said. I just stopped caring what they thought. Well, I care, Evelyn said. And if this brother has proof, real proof, then we need to find out what it is before the sheriff does. Because if you get arrested, there won't be a trial. You know how this town works. They'll hang you and call it justice. Rhett stared at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her to stay out of it, but then he swore under his breath and grabbed his coat. Get your horse. We're going to town. What are we going to do? Find out what the hell this brother thinks he knows. They rode hard, reaching Red Hollow just as the sun was setting. Rhett led them to the boarding house, where Carson's brother was supposedly staying, and knocked on the door. Ruth Calloway answered, her eyes narrowing when she saw Rhett. He's not here, she said. He's at the sheriff's office. Then that's where I'm going, Rhett said, turning to leave. Evelyn caught his arm. Wait, let me go first. If you walk in there, Harris might arrest you on the spot just to keep the peace. Let me find out what the brother is saying. Rhett looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. Fine. But I'm coming with you. I'll wait outside. They walked to the sheriff's office together, and Evelyn slipped inside while Rhett stayed near the door. Harris was sitting at his desk, and across from him sat a man who looked like an older, harder version of Carson Webb. Same sharp features, same wiry build, but with lines of bitterness carved into his face. Miss Mercer, Harris said, looking up. This isn't a good time. I know, Evelyn said, but I need to know what's happening. The whole town is talking about new proof against Rhett Callahan, and if you're about to arrest him, he deserves to know why. The brother leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. Who are you? Someone who cares about the truth, Evelyn said. The truth is that Rhett Callahan killed my brother, the man said, and I've got proof. What proof? The brother reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a letter Carson wrote 2 days before he died. He sent it to our sister in Denver. In it, he says he caught Callahan stealing from the freight company and was planning to report him. He was scared Callahan would retaliate, and he was right. Evelyn's heart sank. Can I see it? Harris handed her the letter, and she read it quickly. It was written in Carson's hand. She recognized it from the inscription in the book Rhett had given her, and it said exactly what the brother claimed, but something about it felt wrong. This doesn't prove Rhett killed him, Evelyn said slowly. It just proves Carson thought Rhett was stealing. But was he? Did you ever find stolen goods? Did anyone else report missing supplies? The brother's jaw tightened. Carson wouldn't lie. I'm not saying he lied, Evelyn said. I'm saying maybe he was wrong. Maybe someone else was stealing, and Carson blamed Rhett because Rhett was an easy target, because people already didn't trust him. That's a hell of a stretch, the brother said. Is it? Evelyn looked at Harris. Did you investigate the theft? Harris shifted uncomfortably. Not thoroughly. Carson died before he could file a formal complaint, and without evidence. So you just assumed Rhett was guilty, Evelyn said, based on a letter and nothing else. Miss Mercer, Harris said, his voice hard. I understand you've got feelings for Callahan, but... This isn't about feelings, Evelyn said. This is about the fact that you're about to ruin a man's life based on assumptions and rumors. If you're going to arrest him, fine, but at least do your job first. Find out who else had access to those supplies. Find out if Carson was right. Because if he wasn't, and you arrest Rhett anyway, then you're no better than the mob that wanted to drive him out of town. The room went silent. The brother looked furious, and Harris looked caught between anger and something that might have been shame. I'll look into it, Harris said finally. But until I do, Callahan stays where I can find him. You tell him that. I will, Evelyn said. She walked out of the office and found Rhett waiting in the shadows. What did they say? He asked. She told him everything, the letter, the accusation, Harris's promise to investigate. Rhett listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. So Carson thought I was stealing, he said when she finished. But you weren't, Evelyn said. Were you? No. Then we need to prove it. How? By finding out who was, Evelyn said. And I think I know where to start. She told him about the book, about the inscription, about the name M. If Carson had someone he trusted enough to inscribe a book to, maybe that person knows something. Maybe they can tell us if Carson mentioned anyone else. It's a start, at least. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, let's find M. It took them 2 days to track down Emma Henry helped, asking around town until someone finally remembered that Carson had been sweet on a woman named Mary Brennan, who'd left Red Hollow years ago to teach school in Denver. Evelyn wrote to her immediately, explaining the situation and begging for any information she might have. Mary's response came a week later, and it changed everything. She wrote that Carson had indeed suspected theft at the freight company, but he'd never been certain it was Rhett. In fact, Carson had mentioned another name, Frank Morrison, the same man who'd been so eager to accuse Rhett. Frank had worked for the freight company briefly and had been fired for drinking on the job. Carson had suspected Frank might be stealing to pay off gambling debts, but he'd never been able to prove it. He was going to confront Frank the night he died, Mary wrote. He told me he was scared, but he felt like he had to do something. I begged him not to go alone, but he wouldn't listen. When I heard he'd been killed, I always wondered if Frank had something to do with it, but I was too afraid to say anything. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. Evelyn read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. Then she took it straight to Sheriff Harris. Harris read it in silence, his face growing darker with every line. When he finished, he set the letter down and rubbed a hand over his face. Damn it, he muttered. Are you going to arrest Frank? Evelyn asked. I'm going to question him, Harris said. And if Mary's willing to testify to what she knew, then, yeah, I'll arrest him. And Rhett? Harris looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost apologetic. I'll clear his name, publicly. It won't undo 8 years of people thinking the worst of him, but it's a start. Thank you, Evelyn said. She rode straight to Rhett's cabin and told him everything. He listened without speaking, and when she finished, he just stared at her like he didn't know what to say. You did this, he said finally. You figured it out. We did it, Evelyn corrected. You kept that book. You gave it to me. That's what led us to Mary. Rhett shook his head slowly. I don't know what to do with this. You don't have to do anything, Evelyn said. Just let yourself believe it. You didn't kill Carson. You didn't steal from him, and now everyone's going to know it. He looked at her, and his eyes were bright with something she'd never seen before. Relief, gratitude, maybe even hope. Come here, he said quietly. She stepped closer, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She wrapped her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. You don't have to thank me, she said. You just have to promise me you'll stop hiding, that you'll come down from this mountain and let people see who you really are. I promise, he said, and for the first time since Evelyn had met him, she believed he meant it. Frank Morrison confessed 3 days later. Faced with Mary's testimony and the weight of his own guilt, he admitted to stealing from the freight company and killing Carson Webb when Carson confronted him. He was arrested and taken to the county jail to await trial, and Sheriff Harris stood in the middle of Red Hollow's main street and told the whole town that Rhett Callahan was innocent. The apology was awkward and insufficient, but it was something. And that night, when Rhett rode into town and walked into the saloon, no one turned away. A few men even nodded. One bought him a drink. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was the beginning of something better. Evelyn watched from across the street, her heart full, and knew that the man who'd saved her life had finally started saving his own. The change in Rhett didn't happen overnight. Clearing his name wasn't the same as erasing 8 years of isolation, and trust, real trust, wasn't something you earned with a single public apology. But slowly, in ways that felt almost accidental, Red Hollow began to let him back in. It started with small things. A nod from the blacksmith when Rhett brought his horse in for new shoes. An invitation from Henry to help repair the bridge on the North Road, which had collapsed under the weight of snow. A conversation with Sheriff Harris that didn't end in hostility. These weren't grand gestures of reconciliation, but they were real. And Rhett held on to them like a man who'd been lost in the dark and was finally seeing light. Evelyn watched it all unfold with a fierce pride she didn't bother hiding. She'd see Rhett working alongside other men, his shoulders less tense than before, his voice joining in conversations instead of staying silent. She'd catch him at the general store, no longer hurrying through his purchases like he expected to be run out at any moment. And once, she even saw him smile. A brief, fleeting thing, but it was there. "You did that," Margaret said one afternoon as they kneaded bread in the Landons' kitchen. She'd been watching Evelyn stare out the window toward the barn, where Rhett and Henry were fixing a broken wagon wheel. "I didn't do anything," Evelyn said. "You did everything," Margaret corrected. "That man was half dead when you got here. Now look at him." Evelyn didn't argue, because Margaret was right. Not that Evelyn had saved Rhett. She wasn't naive enough to believe that, but she'd given him a reason to stop hiding. And maybe that was enough. February gave way to March, and the snow began its slow retreat. The days stretched longer, and the sun carried just enough warmth to make you believe spring might actually come. Rhett started talking about building a new barn on his property, something bigger and sturdier than the lean-to he'd been using. He drew plans on scraps of paper and showed them to Henry, who offered advice and materials. It was the kind of project that meant permanence, and Evelyn's heart squeezed every time she thought about what it represented. He wasn't planning to disappear anymore. One evening in late March, Rhett showed up at the Landon homestead just as the sun was setting. Evelyn was on the porch, mending one of Thomas's shirts, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see him riding in. He dismounted and walked toward her, and she set the sewing aside. "You busy?" he asked. "Not anymore." "Good. Come with me. I want to show you something." She didn't ask what. She just grabbed her coat and followed him to his horse. He pulled her up behind him like he'd done a dozen times before, and they rode north into the mountains, the sky above them bleeding from gold to purple as the light faded. They stopped at a clearing Evelyn had never seen before, a flat stretch of land surrounded by tall pines with a view of the valley below. Rhett dismounted and helped her down, and she stood there looking around, trying to figure out why he'd brought her here. "This is where I'm going to build," he said. Evelyn turned to him. "Build what?" "A house." He gestured toward the clearing. "A real one, not a cabin. Something with enough room to breathe. I'm tired of living like I'm waiting to leave." "Rhett," Evelyn said, her voice catching. It's a lot of work," he said, "and it's going to take time. But I want to do it. I want to have something that's mine, something that isn't about surviving, but about living." She stepped closer, her chest tight with something too big to name. "I think that's a good idea." "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her. "Because I want you to help me plan it." Evelyn unfolded the paper and saw a rough sketch of a house. 2 stories, wide windows, a porch that wrapped around the front. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, real, the kind of place someone could grow old in. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're the only person who's ever made me think I could have something like this," Rhett said. "And because I don't want to build it alone." She looked up at him, and the question she'd been holding on to for months finally came out. "What are we doing, Rhett?" "What do you mean?" "I mean this," she said, gesturing between them. "We're not just friends. We haven't been for a while. But we're not—" She paused, searching for the right words. "We're not anything defined. And I need to know what you want, because I can't keep doing this if you're going to disappear the moment things get too real." Rhett was quiet for a long moment, and Evelyn's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see every line of his face in the fading light. "I want you," he said simply. "I want to wake up every morning and know you're here. I want to build that house and fill it with a life that isn't just about surviving. I want to stop being afraid of what I feel for you and just—" He stopped, his voice rough. "I want to try. I don't know if I'll be any good at it, but I want to try." Evelyn's throat tightened and she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of the scar she'd memorized by now. "I want that too," she whispered. "All of it." He kissed her then, and it wasn't tentative or careful. It was desperate and raw and full of all the things they'd been holding back for too long. Evelyn kissed him back just as hard, her hands fisted in his coat, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing like they'd been running. "I'm not easy to love," Rhett said, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't care," Evelyn said. "Neither am I." "Good," he said, and kissed her again. They stood there in the clearing as the stars came out, wrapped in each other and the cold mountain air, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't quite believe winter was ready to let go. But it came. The snow melted into muddy streams that rushed down the mountainsides, the trees began to bud, and the world that had been locked in ice for months finally started to thaw. Rhett began clearing the land for his house, and Evelyn spent every spare moment helping him. They worked from dawn to dusk, cutting trees and hauling rocks and digging foundations in soil still half frozen. It was brutal work, and there were days when Evelyn's hands were so blistered she could barely hold a hammer. But she didn't stop. Because every log they laid, every stone they placed, felt like a promise. Henry and a few other men from town came out to help once the frame started going up. They didn't say much, but their presence spoke volumes. These were the same men who'd looked at Rhett with suspicion a year ago, and now they were working beside him, raising walls and joking about whose measurements were off. Margaret brought food, stew and bread and pies that tasted like forgiveness. The Garrett kids came too, running wild through the clearing while their mother watched Rhett with a gratitude that never quite faded. Even Sheriff Harris stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on the progress, but really just to stand there and nod approvingly at what Rhett was building. "This is good," Harris said. "Seeing you put down roots, town needs people who stick around." "Didn't think you'd want me sticking around," Rhett said. "Yeah, well," Harris said, looking uncomfortable. "I was wrong. About a lot of things. Figured it was time I said that out loud." It wasn't much of an apology, but Rhett took it. Because he was learning that forgiveness didn't have to be perfect to be real. By mid-April, the house had walls and a roof, and Rhett moved in even though the inside was still raw wood and exposed beams. Evelyn came by every day, bringing blankets and dishes and small things to make the place feel less empty. They ate supper together on the unfinished porch, watching the sun set over the valley, and Rhett would tell her about the plans he had, where the kitchen would go, how he wanted to build shelves for books, the way the bedroom window would face east so they could wake up to the sunrise. He always said they, not I, and Evelyn never corrected him. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch steps watching the stars come out, Rhett took her hand. "I want to marry you," he said. Evelyn's breath caught. "What? I want to marry you," he repeated. "If you'll have me. I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm broke and scarred, and I've got a past that's going to follow me around for the rest of my life. But I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I've got left making sure you never regret saying yes." Evelyn stared at him, her heart hammering. "You love me?" "Yeah," Rhett said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "I do." "I love you too," she said, and the words came out choked with tears she didn't bother hiding. Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms, and they sat there wrapped in each other while the night deepened around them. It wasn't a fairy tale proposal. There was no ring, no grand gesture, just two people who'd been broken by life and had somehow found a way to be whole together. But it was enough. It was more than enough. They were married in May, in the clearing where Rhett had first told Evelyn he wanted to build a house. It was a small ceremony, just the Landons, Sheriff Harris, a handful of townspeople, and the preacher who looked mildly bewildered to be marrying the town outcast to the schoolteacher from Boston. Evelyn wore a simple dress Margaret had helped her sew, and Rhett wore a clean shirt and the kind of nervous expression that made Evelyn want to laugh and cry at the same time. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, there was a beat of silence where Evelyn half expected someone to speak up, but no one did. And when Rhett kissed her, the small crowd clapped, and Evelyn felt something inside her settle. This was real. This was hers. They spent the first weeks of their marriage finishing the house. Rhett built furniture, a table, chairs, a bed frame that he carved their initials into when he thought Evelyn wasn't looking. Evelyn planted a garden, turning the rocky soil until it was soft enough to hold seeds. She planted tomatoes and beans and wildflowers, things that would grow and bloom and prove that life could take root even in the hardest ground. The house filled slowly. Books appeared on the shelves Rhett had built. Quilts Margaret had gifted them covered the bed. A rocking chair Henry had made sat on the porch, and in the kitchen, hanging on a nail by the stove, was the copy of Whitman's poems that had once belonged to Carson Webb, a reminder that the past didn't have to define you, but it could still teach you something if you let it. Summer came, warm and bright, and with it came a rhythm Evelyn had never known she needed. She still taught lessons at the Landon homestead 3 days a week, and Rhett worked the land, building fences and clearing fields, and doing all the things that came with making a life out of nothing. It was hard work, the kind that left you bone-tired and aching, but it was good work, the kind that meant something. And slowly, Red Hollow stopped seeing them as outsiders. They became part of the fabric of the place. Rhett, the man who'd been redeemed, and Evelyn, the woman who'd believed in him when no one else would. People waved when they rode into town. Families invited them to dinners. And when the harvest came and Rhett needed help bringing in the hay, a dozen men showed up without being asked. "Never thought I'd see this," Rhett said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies. "See what?" Evelyn asked. "This. All of it." He gestured toward the valley, toward the fields, toward the life they'd built. "I spent so many years thinking I didn't deserve anything good, that I was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed, and then you showed up and just—" He stopped, shaking his head. "You didn't fix me, but you made me believe I was worth fixing." Evelyn leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "You were always worth it, Rhett. You just couldn't see it." "I see it now," he said quietly. "Thanks to you." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt full instead of empty. And Evelyn thought about the girl she'd been when she left Boston, lost and grieving and drowning in a pain she couldn't escape. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this mountain, to this man, to this life. And she realized that sometimes the hardest roads led you exactly where you needed to be. Not because the destination was perfect, but because the journey changed you into someone who could finally appreciate it. By the time autumn arrived, Evelyn knew she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks, but it wasn't until she missed her second cycle and started feeling sick in the mornings that she was certain. She told Rhett one evening after supper, sitting at the table they'd built together in the house they'd raised with their own hands. "I'm pregnant," she said. Rhett froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "You're what?" "Pregnant," she repeated. And then, because he still looked stunned, she added, "We're going to have a baby." He set the fork down slowly, and for a moment he just stared at her like he didn't know what to say. Then his face cracked open into the widest smile she'd ever seen, and he was out of his chair and pulling her into his arms before she could blink. "We're going to have a baby," he said, like he was testing the words. "A baby. Are you happy?" Evelyn asked, even though she could feel the answer in the way he was holding her. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Rhett said. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "I never thought I'd have this. A family. A home. Someone who loved me enough to stay. And now we're going to have a baby." His voice broke on the last word, and Evelyn saw the shine of tears in his eyes. "We are," she said, her own tears spilling over. "We really are." They stood there into the kitchen, wrapped in each other, and the enormity of what was coming, and Evelyn thought about how far they'd both come. From the broken people they'd been to the life they were building together. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Winter came again, but this time it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a season they could survive together. Rhett spent the cold months working on the house, building a cradle from wood he'd cut himself and sanding it until it was smooth enough that no splinter could ever hurt their child. Evelyn sewed blankets and knitted tiny clothes, her hands moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. Margaret came by often, bringing advice and supplies, and the kind of wisdom that only came from raising 3 children in the wilderness. "It's going to be hard," she said one afternoon as they sat by the fire. "Harder than you think, but it's also going to be the best thing you've ever done." Evelyn believed her. The baby was born in March, just as the snow was starting to melt. It was a long labor, brutal and exhausting, and there were moments when Evelyn thought she couldn't do it. But Rhett was there the entire time, holding her hand and telling her she was strong enough. And when the baby finally came, a girl with dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead, Evelyn felt something inside her shift. This was what she'd been running toward all along. Not away from grief, but toward something bigger. Toward love and life, and a future that wasn't defined by loss. They named her Grace because it felt right. Because grace was what had saved them both. Not the kind that came from above, but the kind that came from choosing to believe in second chances. From choosing to forgive, to hope, to build something beautiful out of the wreckage. Rhett held Grace like she was made of glass, his rough hands impossibly gentle, and Evelyn watched him with a fullness in her chest that felt almost unbearable. This man who'd been so convinced he was broken, who'd spent years hiding from the world, was now cradling their daughter and looking at her like she was the most important thing that had ever existed. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She is," Evelyn agreed. "I'm going to do right by her," Rhett said, his voice fierce. "I'm going to make sure she grows up knowing she's loved, that she's safe, that she never has to be afraid." "I know you will," Evelyn said, "because you're a good man, Rhett, and you're going to be a good father." He looked at her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. "I hope so." "I know so," she said. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and tiny milestones. Grace's first smile, her first laugh, the way she'd grab onto Rhett's finger and hold on like she'd never let go. Evelyn watched her daughter grow and her husband soften even more, and she thought about the fact that healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. A series of small moments that added up to something larger. By the time summer rolled around again, Red Hollow felt less like the place Evelyn had fled to and more like the place she'd chosen. She had friends here, real friends, not just acquaintances. She had a home that felt solid and safe, and she had a family that was entirely her own. One evening in late June, she and Rhett sat on the porch with Grace asleep between them, wrapped in one of the blankets Evelyn had made. The sun was setting over the valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the world felt impossibly still. "Do you ever think about Boston?" Rhett asked. Evelyn considered the question. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. It doesn't hurt anymore." "What changed?" "I did," she said. "I stopped running from what I'd lost and started building toward what I had. And I think—" She paused, trying to find the right words. "I think grief doesn't disappear. It just gets smaller. It makes room for other things, for joy and hope, and all the stuff that makes life worth living." Rhett nodded slowly. "I used to think I didn't deserve those things." "And now?" "Now I think maybe we don't get what we deserve," he said. "We just get what we're brave enough to fight for." Evelyn reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then I'm glad we fought." "Me too," Rhett said. They sat there as the stars came out, and Evelyn thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the wolves and the storm and the man who'd pulled her out of the snow, about the town that had judged him and the truth that had set him free, about the house they'd built and the daughter they'd made and the life they were living. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she left Boston. It was harder and messier and required more from her than she'd known she had to give. But it was also richer and fuller and more real than anything she'd ever dreamed of. Because the truth about survival, the thing no one tells you, is that it's not about enduring the storm. It's about finding the people who'll stand with you in the middle of it. It's about building something solid enough to withstand the wind. It's about learning that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, and that sometimes the hardest journeys lead you to the softest landings. Evelyn had come to Red Hollow to escape her grief, but what she'd found instead was a reason to live. A man who needed saving as much as she did, a community that had learned to forgive, and a future that stretched out before her like the valley below, wide and open and full of possibility. She'd survived the storm. They both had. And now together, they were building something that could weather whatever came next. Years later, when Grace was old enough to ask questions, she'd point to the scar on her father's face and ask how he got it. And Rhett would tell her the truth, that he'd fought in a war and done things he wasn't proud of, but that he'd learned from them. That mistakes didn't define you, but what you did after them could. And when Grace asked how her parents met, Evelyn would tell her about the wolves and the storm and the man who'd saved her life. But she'd also tell her the rest of it, the hard parts, the messy parts, The parts where love wasn't easy but worth fighting for. Because that was the story Evelyn wanted her daughter to know. Not a fairy tale where everything was perfect, but a real story about real people who'd stumbled and fallen and gotten back up, who'd made mistakes and owned them, who'd been scared and lonely and convinced they didn't deserve happiness, but who'd chosen to believe otherwise. That was the legacy Evelyn wanted to leave. Not perfection, but resilience. Not ease, but effort. Not a life without pain, but a life that made room for joy despite it. And as she watched Grace grow, watched her learn to walk and talk and eventually ride horses through the same mountains that had nearly killed Evelyn all those years ago, she knew that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning, because that's what life was. Not a destination, but a journey. Not an ending, but a series of new beginnings strung together by the choices we made and the people we chose to make them with. Evelyn had chosen Rhett, and Rhett had chosen her. And together, they'd chosen to build a life that proved the wilderness didn't have to win. That love could grow even in the coldest ground. That redemption was possible, even for the people who thought they were beyond saving. They'd survived the storm, and now they were living in the sunlight that came after.